Good evening, everyone, and welcome to December 6, 2021 Blue Ribbon Pension Review Committee meeting. To help slow the transmission of COVID-19 and protect the health and safety of the community, City Council as well as Board and Commission meetings will continue to be closed to the public for in-person attendance. The public is encouraged to watch and participate from the safety of their homes to practice social distancing. Meetings are broadcast live on Glendale TV, viewable on Spectrum Cable, Channel 6, and AT&T Uverse, Channel 99. Meetings are also streamed live in high definition on the city's webpage, glendaleca.gov/live, on youtube.com/myglendale, and on Apple TV, Roku, and Amazon Fire devices using a free app called ScreenView and choosing Glendale TV from the menu. For public comments and questions during the meeting, please call 818-937-8100. Public comments on a specific agenda item will be taken when that agenda item is discussed. Now I will conduct a roll call. Committee Member Manning,
Unmute me. Okay, I'm here.
Committee Member Knight, Committee Member Macias, Committee Member Finch,
Here.
Committee Member Michaels,
Present.
Committee Member Molano,
Here.
Committee Member Payne,
Here.
Committee Member Paulus, Committee Member Kadikian,
Here.
Committee Member Vance,
Here.
Committee Member Zakarian,
Here.
Committee Member Amirian,
Present.
Committee Member Nelson, Committee Member Wolfson.
Here.
Next on the agenda, item number 1, posting of the agenda. The agenda for December 6, 2021 Blue Ribbon Pension Review Committee was posted on December 3 bulletin board outside City Hall. Item number 2, oral communications. We do not have callers at this time. Item number 3, minutes. 3A, approval of minutes from November 15, 2021 regular meeting.
Does anybody have a comment on the minutes?
No.
If not, can I get a motion?
I move the minutes to be approved.
I'll second it.
Vlad, can we get a roll call?
Yes, Committee Member Manning,
Yes.
Committee Member Knight, Committee Member Macias, Committee Member Finch,
Yes.
Committee Member Michaels,
Yes.
Committee Member Molano,
Yes.
Committee Member Bain,
Yes.
Committee Member Palos, Committee Member Kadikian,
Yes.
Committee Member Vance,
Yes.
Committee Member Zakarian,
Yes.
Committee Member Amirian,
Yes.
Committee Member Nelson, and Committee Member Wilson.
Yes.
Next on the agenda, under item number 4, business items, 4A, presentation from Michael Cohen, Calpers Chief Financial Officer.
Well, before Michael speaks, first of all, good evening and welcome back. We're very fortunate tonight to have Michael Cohen from Calpers to speak to us and do a presentation and take questions. So Michael joined Calpers as the Chief Financial Officer in October 2018. He brings to his role more than 20 years of experience in government. Prior to joining CalPERS, he served as the director of the California Department of Finance, where he managed the $201 billion state budget on behalf of Governor Jerry Brown. In addition, he spent 13 years in the state LAO's office. So Michael, I just want to say thank you for being here. I've worked with Michael. Michael is a guy who, let me say, I don't want to bias anybody. Calpers is not always easy to work with. However, Michael is the guy you go to for reasonable solutions and reasonable talk. So anyway, Michael, thanks for being here.
Thanks, John, and thank you everyone for having me and for participating in this commission. I know it's not always the easiest topic, but it's obviously an important public policy issue, and I always appreciate when citizens are willing to dig into such a topic on their own time. I think I sent some slides that hopefully someone can put up for us, and I believe you got them at the beginning of the weekend. So I've got about 20 slides. Certainly feel free to stop me as we go if you've got questions about the specifics of what I'm saying. Suggest that we'll have plenty of time at the end for discussion and questions and answers and so forth. But certainly stop me if you need clarification on anything. With that, if we could go to the next slide, please.
Give us 1 sec to just get it in the right format here.
You bet.
WebEx is a little bit of a challenge for us. Yeah, I can't. Can everybody see that okay? Yes, no? Yes? Okay. Okay.
Looks good on my screen. So here's just what I'm going to cover. I'm going to focus my conversation about the asset liability management process, which is basically every 4-year process by which Calpers sort of kicks the tires on all of the assumptions underlying the system. The assets are really the investment office lead, the liabilities are actuarial office, and then the management of the process is really where I come into play, sort of coordinating throughout the enterprise between the actuarial office and the investment office. And so this is really something, these slides are based on a webinar we did last week as kind of a wrap up for our decision-making process. As I'll get into, this was a year-long process. We certainly did everything we could to outreach to local communities, local employers throughout our system, as well as labor and retirees. And if you want more than what you're getting today, there is a dedicated webpage on the Calpers site. If you just type ALM into the search bar, you'll get a page that has all of the webinars from this past year stored there, as well as additional materials. So why don't we go ahead and move on to the next slide. So this is a nice kind of recap leading up to what our board did in November. So as I said, the ALM process is once every 4 years. So we've been doing all of that through 2021, and we sort of started towards the second half of 2020. As many of you may know, the last fiscal year was fantastic for most pension funds. Calpers returned 21.3%, riding the high of the stock market and our investment decisions. I'll talk about more in a couple minutes, the funding risk mitigation policy. That's a policy that was adopted in 2015, really by our board, really designed to acknowledge that over the long term, the expectations for returns in the marketplace were going down. And so it was designed to take advantage of good years to sort of nudge down the discount rate. And because of the 21% return, this was the first year that the policy was triggered. And that sort of automatically lowered the discount rate to 6.8%. After that happened in September, our board took a look at the new capital market assumptions. That's really just sort of the technical term for the experts in the field's expectations of what the market will yield going forward over the next 20 years. Sort of, obviously no one knows what the future will bring, but it's sort of the experts' best estimate of what they think each asset class, whether you're talking about bonds or public equities, the stock market, what they think each of those asset classes will yield over the next couple of decades. And then in November, our board asked to see 3 different candidate portfolios between 6.5 to 6.8 that was triggered by the risk mitigation policy, and the 7% sort of our old discount rate, as well as within theirs, we'll talk about some more different levels of leverage, sort of borrowing against our assets to invest. And we'll get into that in a little bit. So why don't we go ahead and go to the next slide if we could. So this slide just tries to capture the essence of our risk mitigation policy. Basically, there's tiers of if we get good returns, so anything starting with 2 percentage points over what our expectations are. So starting at 9% when we were under a 7% world, up to 24%, sort of there are bands that determine how much the discount rate will come down. And so you see under the 21%, because 21% is between 20 and 24, we end up at this 20 basis points, 0.2% reduction in the discount rate. And that happens automatically under the policy. That being said, the board and everyone knew we were going through this more thorough asset liability management process at the same time. And so it wasn't really validated until the November board meeting. If we can go to the next slide, there's a sort of a graphical illustration of what the policy does. And so, as I mentioned, the capital market assumptions, the long-term trend on them are going down. And the reason for that is because you've got a world in which risk-free investments, basically the treasury bonds, whereas you used to get, a number of percentage points basically without taking any risk in the market. As you know, those interest rates have gone to nearly zero. So as you're chasing more and more returns, you're taking on higher risks, and it's lowering the expected level of returns for the long term. And so what our board decided to do was, rather than sort of layer a discount rate reduction in a big chunk in a particular year where you could end up having bad returns and where everyone's financially stressed, instead they wanted to use the good years to gently nudge down the discount rate. And how it works is that it's basically split 50-50, where there's rate reductions to employers like your city, and then the other half of the better than expected returns get used to lower the discount rate. And so the black line here is if we had no policy and you just sort of had a 7% return. The blue line would have been that if we just took the full 21% return and rolled it into a rate reduction the way things normally work with our investment returns. And instead you end up with the orange line somewhere in between, where you're sort of splitting things half and half. And I've got a couple of graphs at the end of the presentation that really look at your Glendale rates in particular, so you'll have a better sense of what this means for you going forward. So if we can go ahead and move on to the next slide. This slide just tries to capture what our board was wrestling with when they came to the discount rate decision. The discount rate, I think you all know this, but it's really worth repeating that it's the core and probably the most important decision our board makes, particularly in the years where we're going through the ALM process, because it drives all of the numbers that underlie the entire system. It's sort of our long-term expectation of how much we're going to grow our liabilities and how much we expect to earn each and every year over the long term. And obviously, in some years, you're not going to earn exactly 7% or 6.8%, but over the long term, you expect these things to average out, and that's sort of the target. So really, some of the factors our board was wrestling with is how much of the portfolio, which is now nearly $500 billion, how much to put into private assets, meaning private equity, direct lending, and real estate. And so when we say private assets, it's really in contrast to public assets, things that are available on the stock market or available in terms of treasury bond purchases. We'll talk more about leverage. I've already mentioned that. There's also, I'll get into this, there's another slide in a minute, sort of our tolerance for drawdown risk. That's basically we know there's going to be years over the next 20 when things are bad. And so really trying to evaluate how much can we withstand in those bad years. And then finally, a key factor and really at a heart of many of the conversations were employers, cities, special districts, and counties that are all members of our system, as well as school districts, sort of your ability to handle rate increases and cost increases over time. And obviously, there's even within the employer's ability to pay, there's really a balance between picking a reasonable number so that you have less volatility in your rates over time versus, obviously if we picked the highest investment return that's reasonable, you would have lower rates in the short term. But if we're not actually going to be able to achieve that rate, you're going to end up with a lot of volatility and the rates will end up even higher over time. So there's a balance within the employer's ability to pay concept as well. Why don't we go ahead and move on to the next slide? And so this slide goes more into detail on drawdown risk. Volatility is probably something that you've heard before in terms of our investments. They do tend to be fairly volatile. That ties in with the stock market being very volatile. As we've moved more and more to things like public equity, we've moved away from the sure thing of treasury bonds. And that's brought a lot of volatility. But really over the last few years, what our board's been more focused on is what you see in this chart, the red area. Those are the worst of the bad. And so everything to the left side of the purple line are really the lower than average years, and then focused on kind of the red area where you're having the extreme, stock market crashes and so forth. So really the way the model works is focusing on the worst 10% of the years in thousands of simulations and doing it over a rolling three-year period. So you're constantly you're not just worried about, okay, if the stock market drops and then bounces back up in the model, you're more concerned of if it drops and then takes a while to bounce back, because those are the things that really hurt the system. And the reason that our board has focused on this is that sort of the bad years are what can kill a pension system. Obviously it's great to have good years. You've sort of, the 21% was a very good year, but if you compare it to some other systems, you'll see that we were a lower return than those other systems. And a lot of that has to do with, we actually did better the year prior when sort of the pandemic started than a lot of other systems. And that's because we were sort of protecting against the downside risk and willing to give some of the upside away, in essence. And so that's been sort of the board's very conscious decision over the last number of years. So if we go to the next slide, we'll get more into the investment philosophy here. These are the portfolios that our board looked at, and just sort of to jump to the end of the decision-making process in November, we ended up in portfolio B2, which is 6.8%. But you see our board was looking at both the drawdown percentages, kind of the loss of assets that would occur in those worst scenarios, as well as the traditional measure of volatility. And ultimately, we landed at a spot where we weren't the most volatile. We also weren't the least volatile. It kind of all of the balance ended up with kind of somewhere in between, which makes sense that you're balancing a lot of different competing demands. And so we ended up with a scenario where the board confirmed the 6.8% under the funding risk mitigation policy, and sort of set the 6.8 as our new target, as well as you'll see they for the first time added a 5% asset allocation to leverage, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. So if we can go to the next slide. This is just a quick summary again of what I just said. The board did select portfolio B2. The really key things are this new addition of 5% leverage to our asset allocation, as well as increased allocations to private assets. Whereas under the old allocation, we were more at 21% of our assets were allocated to the private world. We're now up to roughly a third. and I'll get into as well. There were some actuarial assumptions adopted as we do every 4 years. They tended to balance each other out for most plans. Obviously, we've got thousands of jurisdictions and thousands of plans within the system, so every plan is a little bit different. But for most of the plans, the actuarial assumptions didn't have a tremendous effect on the long-term projections. Why don't we go to the next slide, please?
Just a reminder to everybody that feel free to ask Michael questions as we go.
So there's strategic asset allocation. This is really sort of the board's direction to our investment team on how to invest our, as I mentioned, $500 billion. And so you can't sort of make huge changes on a dime. It's not something you would pull off in a week or a month. And instead, our investment team is really going to be pulling together a plan over the next number of months to bring to our board. And we want to manage the implementation so that we position the system in the best possible way, taking opportunities where they present themselves. And also, we're such a big player in markets, we don't want to indicate ahead of time where exactly we're going, so that people can take advantage of that and sort of cost Calpers money. As I mentioned, the notable change, the increase in private equity, real assets, private debt, up to about a third of our investments, the 5% leverage, as well as we increase our private assets, the private assets, we're able to reduce the public assets. And so that was a conscious decision as well. So why don't we go ahead and go to the next slide?
Michael, I had a question.
Sure.
When you say 5% leverage, what are we talking? Could you explain it in simpler
I've got
terms?
a slide coming up here. I'll absolutely get into that.
Thank you.
You bet. So if we can go to this slide, is just a graphical illustration of what I was just saying. If you want the specifics of how things were changed, and this is where you start to see leverage come into play. Whereas previously we've been doing leverage for years, which is really just borrowing against the assets of the fund to invest elsewhere. But this is the first time that we're putting leverage into our strategy for the next 4 years. And so you see sort of the 5%. In essence, you're borrowing against the Calpers assets to buy additional assets. And you end up with sort of 105% and taking advantage of the upside potential of some of the diversity that comes with the overall plan here, that once the board decided on 6.8%, you can then use the leverage to basically diversify your portfolio. So I think that the next slide will get into leverage in even more detail. So I won't read this verbatim to you, but this slide's trying to get to the heart of what leverage is. So it's basically borrowing against some of our assets and then using that money to diversify. It does let us get away from some of the riskier assets, particularly the stock market, which is particularly volatile. It gives us a better mix. But that being said, we have been very careful throughout this process to make sure everyone realizes we are well aware that leverage can add complexity to the overall portfolio, and that in some scenarios, you're going to end up, just as you're going to end up with better returns in many scenarios, you can end up with worse returns in particular scenarios if things go wrong for the investment team. So that's clear. That there's more upside, but there's certainly that downside as well. And it's worth saying it's not something that our investment team is going to go right up to 5% immediately. It's one of these things that, just like investing in private equity or private debt, you can't do it all at once. So it's going to be an incremental approach when the opportunity presents itself. And that's something that we do have the expertise to try to target those best opportunities. So why don't we go on to the next slide, and we can come back if there's further questions at the end. Private assets, I've mentioned them a lot. The reason I have mentioned them a lot is that If you look historically, private equity is by far the best asset class, particularly even when you consider net of fees. So just on an apples to apples basis, private equity is the one that provides the best returns. And so in order to get something like 6.8%, you have to go into these private classes. When we were looking at the portfolios, I neglected to point out basically that under those new capital market assumptions, basically our old portfolio was only expected to earn 6.2%. And so that really hammers home the point about why we're moving more and more into private assets, because those are the asset classes that can pull up a 6.2% to a 6.8% without dramatically increasing your volatility. And the rest of the slide here, they also provide diversity and access to other parts of the market that just aren't really hit in the stock market, more that they haven't gone public yet. This is going to be the only way that you get into those opportunities. So why don't we go ahead and move on to the next slide. So, and now we're getting more into the actuarial side of things, what all of this means for a particular plan like Glendale. So as I mentioned, our board did affirm the 6.8% level that's guided by our risk mitigation policy, because we're now expecting less returns every year for the next multiple decades. The normal cost, which I know you've talked about, but it's worth repeating what the term means. That's basically the annual cost of the system. So for a year's worth of public employees' service, what it's expected to cost. And because you're now expecting 6.8% on all of the money set aside for that individual's year of work, it's going to cost a little bit more. And also, most plans in our system do have an unfunded liability. You know, obviously, if you're expecting to return less each year for the long term, that also increases when you lower the discount rate. When this starts having an effect for schools and the state, they'll start facing the new cost that we'll talk about in a little bit, starting in July 1st. You, as a public agency, won't see any effect on your rates until 23-24. So July 1, 2023 is when all of this will come into effect for the city of Glendale. So next slide. So in this just, again, kind of tries to capture in one place all of the different actuarial factors that are going into the rate calculations. And, you know, I know you've talked about these. You've got some actuaries on your commission, so I won't belabor it, but really it's kind of the expectations for long-term inflation as well as mortality are probably the two big factors, as you know. But obviously, when people are choosing to retire, how many people are coming into the system and leaving the system, all of that gets combined into a rate, which we tend to measure as a percent of payroll. And so you see here the net result for employers when you account for the 21% is that for most employers, there's either a small reduction, or in the case of public agencies, there's really the average plan isn't seeing any rate change at all as a result of all of these sort of countervailing forces. So why don't we go on to the next slide, please? And this is where you really can see what this means when you pull it all together for the city of Glendale. The blue lines are what, if a year ago you had asked, well, what's the expectation for your rates over the next 30 years, you would have seen we expect them to gradually come down, both for miscellaneous employees as well as safety employees. But now under the new policies, because we're rolling in both the 21% and the discount rate reduction at the same time, you see you're actually should be facing lower rates going forward. Long term, the reason that the lines are going down is because of the public pension reform, PEPRA, that affects all new public agency hires as well as state hires post 2013 because of the lower costs of those new hires. So as they sort of come into the system and the classic members, as they're called, sort of move out of the system, you end up with a gradual rate reduction. And you can
Mr.
really,
Cohen?
yeah.
Thank you very much so far for the for this presentation. I want to see if I can put the numbers relative to Glendale. The city finance just released the CAFR that they're going to present to the city council next week. And I was looking at a page where it looks at the net pension liability, and they did on this page, they give a sample of the current discount rate, and then two comparisons, one to a 1% decrease and a 1% increase. And it looks like with a 1% increase, let's say from 7.15 discount rate to a 6.15, it's close to $300 million. And I figured that is a substantial amount of what does it mean in terms of real dollars to a city's budget, right? When you have, according to the CAFR, some pretty significant deferred outflows, close to $88 million. And so talking about the discount or the percentages or the lower discount rate without looking at these net numbers in what the impact of the city is becomes kind of ambiguous to me. And I was wondering, when we look at the numbers that we now have in the unfunded liability, which is around $640 million, and now we have this expected lower discount rates going into the future. I wonder if cities like Glendale that have a general fund of $232 million, what the overall level of impact it is for the cities. I know that you're referring to the sustainability of the fund for the pension system. I want to see how I can make this related to the level of impact that cities have. And I'm assuming that city representatives or the employers have addressed this to Calpers as to the significance of what it means to budget reductions for general use as a result of this lower discount rate. So my question is, have other cities explained or are worried about this lower discount rate and what it would mean to their general fund going forward in this next few years?
Certainly, it's something we've spent a lot of time over the last, well, I've been with Calpers, as you heard, for 3 years, and it's really sort of something I do regularly is check in with various local governments. And we do have, like your city, we offer public comment in all of our meetings, as well as having stakeholder outreach. And we did these webinars. We probably did 5 or 6 over the last year or so to provide them an opportunity to have input. For the most part, I'm not going to speak for every city. For the most part, we heard, that they were generally okay with sort of the 6.8% level. That obviously, as I sort of mentioned earlier, everyone would love a 7 or an 8 or a 9% discount rate to lower the expected cost, but it's got to be something realistic. And I think for the most part, the city community found the 6.8% level to be kind of a good balance of all of the competing factors that, we heard they wanted it to be realistic. They didn't want a lot of volatility in the rates because of the budgeting concerns that, if you're doing a 5-year forecast, you want to have some level of certainty in what you're plugging in for your expected pension costs. There's a lot of factors that are outside of Calpers' control in the volatility of rates, but there's some that's within ours, and setting a reasonable discount rate is something that is kind of our responsibility to do. And I think for the most part, the local government community, cities, counties, and special districts thought the 6.8% was a reasonable landing spot, particularly given we fully recognize that when the rate came down from 7.5% to 7% over 3 years and a few years ago, that was a pretty substantial drop, and it strained a lot of local government budgets. And so by deferring to our risk mitigation policy, sort of this notion of gradual nudging down of the discount rate, it gave a lot of people more comfort than taking a big chunk all at once, or doing a big chunk when you were coming off of a subpar year, and so you'd be sort of doubling up on the fiscal hit of lowering the discount rate. But obviously, I don't want to speak for every city because there's 480 different opinions on where they should go. Not all of them are members of Calpers, but most of them are.
Okay, Mr. Holtzman, if I may. This is Ari Marion.
Yes, sorry, I couldn't get off mute fast enough. Yeah, go on.
Mr. Cohen, thank you. And I just have kind of a follow-up question to Mr. Milano's question. So what is the impact of missed projections, at 6.8% discount versus a 6.5% discount rate? I mean, I understand that lowering the discount rate, as you've explained it, has a greater current impact to municipalities. However, what is the impact if those investment projections are missed at the higher rate versus the lower rate, especially considering that your experts predicted 6.2% over the next 20 years?
Yeah, and I should be clear that 6.2% was under our old strategic asset allocation. So if we had done nothing, the experts would have said we would only earn 6.2% over the next 20 years. And so I think that on a percentage basis, if you wanted to sort of put probabilities, basically they're roughly equal of earning a 6.8 versus a 6.5 because we've adjusted our investment strategy to try to target that 6.8. Now, that being said, we take more risk in doing so. So you will end up with some more volatility, and maybe we can go back to, we can go back to slide, I think it's maybe 9. Sorry, I go back one more. There we go. So you sort of see there's certainly, our, if we had gone to a 6.5% under A1, you could have gotten your volatility down to 10.9% or 10.8% under A2, and we're at 12%. So we're going to have, an extra percentage point of volatility, and in those sort of the worst 10% of the years, that drawdown column, we're going to end up with, close to 3% worse drawdown. So, but that being said, we're always going to sort of whatever the board sets as the discount rate, we're going to devise the best strategy possible, knowing what we know to try to hit it. But really, the long-term implications of not meeting the discount rate are going to be the same under any discount rate. That whereas once the discount rate is set, you're basically paying a fixed amount on your normal cost to try to cover those costs. But if you miss it, rather than it being shared between employees and employers, it becomes an unfunded liability that's exclusively paid by the city. And then it becomes a debt that you're really earning or paying 6.8% on that debt. So obviously you wouldn't want to have a strategy of having a 6.8% discount rate, but an asset allocation that only is expected to give you 6.2, because that's building in a guaranteed, kind of debt creation long-term. Everything assuming the experts are pretty close.
Right. So just to follow up, because I want to make sure that I understand this. So there's an increase of risk now, in an individual or a smaller, in a smaller kind of investment or pension system, maybe that risk is justified. But I'm wondering, considering that municipalities, once you get to a certain percentage of, once your assets are only a certain percentage of your, liabilities, then the likelihood of kind of clawing your way out of that hole becomes less and less. So what A2 versus B2, for example, what was the thinking on behalf of the board in terms of taking, what I think is a significantly higher amount of risk? I know it's represented as a 1.2% in terms of the volatility, but I think that has a different impact in terms of what that might affect municipalities if their unfunded liabilities grow beyond a certain percentage point. What was the thought process behind taking that riskier approach?
Sure, and I think it kind of builds on my answer to the previous question about what were cities thinking, and it goes beyond that. Our board, I don't think, heard more than just a couple of comments suggesting that we go to something as sort of low as 6.5%, where they heard a lot of public comment advising no lower than 6.8 from the labor unions representing the members of our system, from all of the local government representatives. That was pretty universal, that very few, if any, folks wanted to go as low as 6.5%. And so they certainly considered it, but this is a balancing act of there's no kind of 20 years from now, you'll be able to look back and go, oh, that was the right answer. But right now, I would say it's sort of a risk tolerance. From your comments, I would say you're more risk averse than the average board member and the average public testimony that our board heard. So it's not. It was kind of a balancing of all these different factors. I can't point to one thing, but I will say the board did not get a lot of encouragement to go to 6.5%.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I'm sorry, Mr. Rolla, one last comment on my side. In terms of being risk adverse versus not risk adverse, I mean, I'm a small business owner, and so my tolerance for risk, for example, for me personally and for my family, is something different than if I took some money to Vegas, and maybe my tolerance for risk there would be a little bit higher, versus managing a pension of $500 billion, and the municipalities that are going to affect, the future of my family, my children's family, my children's children's family. So that in terms of being, less risk adverse, you mentioned some stakeholders were, on your chart, it's listed as the employer's ability to pay, and that's kind of the balancing. But the employer's ability to pay is really based upon the taxpayers, putting their money into the system. It affects the taxpayers directly. Were the taxpayers represented during these comments, other than by the actual municipalities, the staff members of the municipalities themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I don't recall any sort of taxpayer-specific advocacy groups coming to our board meeting. They're certainly welcome to, but you're absolutely right that every dollar we have in our trust is sort of on behalf of taxpayers and their ability to get state and municipal services. So our board sort of recognizes when they sit up there on the board, they have a fiduciary duty to all of the members of the pension system. So all of those people who are already retired, all the ones currently working, and that is probably, if I wanted to give you one reason why they ended up at the 6.8, that was sort of where they felt their fiduciary duty led them to, that they felt that was the most appropriate rate given all the information they received. But certainly they recognized the great responsibility that comes with sitting on a board that has so many hundreds of thousands of members, and that all of the governments in California have made promises to the folks who have worked for them over the time, and making sure that everyone is paid what they were promised is their number one responsibility.
And
Mr.
that
Cohen?
fiduciary duty, just because you mentioned it, so that fiduciary duty, as far as Calpers is concerned, is to the actual pension, the people who are the workers getting those pensions.
Yes.
There is no
Yes,
fiduciary
and
duty
that's
to the taxpayers, right? That is legally.
It's all laid out in the state constitution, and it is a duty to the members is the primary duty. That's quite clear.
I appreciate it, Mr. Cohen.
Sure.
Mr. Cohen, what was the effective rate of return for the last 20 years?
You know, I should have that off the top of my head. It's something above 7%. I know that's been one of the questions we normally get is, well, why are you lowering the rate if over the last 20 years you've actually exceeded what the rate is? So I know it's above 7. Off the top of my head, I think it's closer to 8%. And you know, the response I always give is, hey, you know, the past is not a prediction of the future, and that, you know, those last 20 years had much higher interest rates than people are expecting going forward. And so it's certainly a good benchmark to look back and think about how much we've earned historically, but it's also, you have to factor in the current economic environment and what we expect moving forward as well.
Let me do a follow-up on that, if I may. I'm trying to figure out to see what would be a prudent city policy, right? So if the city takes that 7.8% rate of return going forward for the next 20 years on average, and Calpers deems that to be a prudent number to use, I would imagine that cities, when they are thinking, or the city council, when they're thinking of approving a pension increase to their employees, would say, look, we have a ceiling of what is expected, 6.8% return. Will these benefits, when calculated out into the future, have sufficient funds at 6.8%, given what we've done in order to, let's say, reduce the number of years of work, let's say early retirement, increase their benefits by, 2.5 percentage points. So it looks like we're doing this thing backwards, right? The cities set the promises, and then it is up to Calpers somehow to figure out how to manage to have sufficient funds to cover it, as opposed to saying, oh, we only can expect 6.8% return. Cities, you should limit those benefits so that we are able to really meet it, right? Because at the end, if Calpers cannot meet that expected rate of return, then additional city funds need to be provided basically to make up that promise. So I was wondering if ever a city or an entity or municipality or local government comes to Calpers and says, we plan to give these additional benefits. Let's say lowering all of the employees' retirement age to age 52, just as a hypothetical example. That would have a huge impact on the expected benefits going forward. Do these municipalities ever come to Calpers and say, give us a guideline? Is this prudent? Yes or no? Does that ever happen?
Yeah, I mean, interesting point, and I think I would go back to sort of PEPRA, the Pension Reform Act in 2012. It really fundamentally changed the dynamics of pension policy at the municipal level, whereas previously there was really, a variety of menu of formulas that jurisdictions could choose from, and we ended up with a situation where most went to the most generous over time so they could compete with neighboring jurisdictions. Under PEPRA, there's not nearly the same choice for a city to offer an increased pension benefit. It's really all standardized at a higher retirement age than the previous system, at a lower benefit formula. And so there's not that same sort of dynamic where, we would obviously, if someone's looking to propose legislation, we'd be happy to cost something out. But absent sort of going to the legislature and saying, we want to increase this benefit or provide this option to increase a benefit, jurisdictions don't have that flexibility anymore. So it's not something that your city could largely even consider absent, some on the obviously when you give people pay increases, that increases your pension costs as well. But there's sort of lowering the retirement age or increasing the retirement formula is not something that a city council could even do, even if they wanted to.
Excellent. Just one follow-up on that, because it was a hypothetical that we discussed at a previous meeting. Let's say you have a city council that is very prudent, and in their negotiation, they are considering maybe increasing the number of salary steps, right? That will increase an additional 2.5% per year for another 5 years, right? Really extend it, fixed it in there, which will have an impact on their future pension obligation. Does Calpers provide sort of like sort of like a pro forma or an estimate, right, of what that impact of those potential increases might be? In other words, serve as a consultant to a city to say, if you do this type of benefit change, or in this case, pay raises, your impact will be such, and then come back with the city with the actual numbers that they could use in discussions of an MOU. Is that a possibility, or has Calpers ever used that type of tactic to help cities prepare a prudent MOU before they approve it?
Yeah, one of the things that got a lot of discussion in the last couple of years in the legislature, and there was a new bill that passed, actually requires us to offer a service we've been offering for the last number of years. That is basically, we've got an email address set up where if cities want to run some language by us in terms of their collective bargaining process, we absolutely will review it. And, that combined with every city has a Calpers actuary, sort of who is your lead actuary, who can provide sort of costing in various scenarios. You sort of referenced earlier the annual financial report having scenario analysis. That's something that I think probably came directly from our annual valuation that we give to every jurisdiction. If you go, those are all on our website, publicly available. So there's various sort of scenario planning that we provide pro forma to every jurisdiction. But then if a particular jurisdiction has special questions dealing with their negotiations, we're certainly happy to provide information. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. That was a very valuable input for me. Thanks so much.
If I may add, being part of the negotiating team on the labor negotiations that we go through, we do cost out our entire benefit load for the duration of the contracts that we're discussing throughout the negotiations with each of our groups. So we utilize the PERS information that we get with the rates, the projected rates for the future as far out as we can go. So if we're talking about a 3-year contract, we do look at that and do cost that out so that we do our best as far as trying to anticipate what those annual costs would be for each of those contracts. The tricky part is, not knowing the different variables that do impact the rates. Obviously, the investment returns and any of the other demographic information. So, but the information we do utilize is what we get from PERS as far as the projected rates.
Ms. Flynn? Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. May I ask a question? I hate to interrupt, but now that I got myself unmuted, it seems to be an involuntary thing on this committee. So I want to bring up a few questions I had. So I have reviewed the Calpers investment information, the annual investment report. It was the most recent one that was available at the time. It was from June 30th of 2020. That time, the portfolio was a little bit shy of 400 billion. It was at 394 billion. Now it's at 500 billion, which is, I think, a substantial increase in the assets. I have some concerns about this leverage that you're talking about, because I'm concerned about the risk involved in that. Essentially, I think you're talking about maybe a high-level version of margin, right? You're going to borrow against the portfolios that you can invest in things that may be even more speculative, I'm not sure. And it seems like that may be a very risky thing to do at this time. Can you speak to that? Are you locked into that once you make that decision? Is that now for 4 years? It's always going to be 5%, whatever? Thank you.
Yes. So one, we're not going to do the leverage if we don't think it makes sense in a current market environment. So just because we've allocated to it doesn't mean now our investment folks have to, even if they don't have sort of the commitment intellectually to the leverage investment. But it is kind of our board's guidance now. Within parameters, as I mentioned earlier, it would take, even under the most aggressive pursuit, a number of years to get up to that 5% allocation. But more to your question of, is it locked in? Our board reviews our strategic allocation on a regular basis. They'll continue to do that. This is obviously something new for them, so they're going to expect sort of reports back in terms of how it's working and be able to evaluate whether or not it makes sense. We're in the process of hiring a new chief investment officer. I would suspect that individual will have, some opinions on this as well. And
I'd just like to suggest that they keep a close watch on interest rates.
That's certainly something that the investment office is going to always do.
It's so critical. Maybe not wait for the board to, convene. Thanks.
So
thank you for your presentation, though. I appreciate it.
I have a follow-up question with regards to the margins or leverage. From what I understand, it's a glorified margin of some sort, but you go out and borrow money from somebody to use that money to invest. And since this committee is looking for solutions for our unfunded obligations, can you come to the city and ask to borrow money from the city? At least instead of the banker making the 3%, for sure from Calpers, the city will be making the 3 or 4%. Is that an option?
We're certainly open to all ideas, but I would be shocked if we were paying 3 or 4% on the leverage, because then at that point, if you're trying to earn 6.8%, there's just not enough spread to have it pay off. So, we're taking a look right now in terms of what we think the costs are going to be for implementing this, but it's not something that I'm guessing the city would go, why am I going to give you a bunch of money and only get, let's say, 1 or 2% on your cash, when you could, invest it with Calpers and make a discretionary payment to us and earn, in essence, 6.8% on it. So I'm certainly open to all creative ideas, but I don't think that's going to be the landing point of where we can find the cheapest money to invest. Because the city's just not going to be happy with what we'd be offering to pay.
So let me just remind everybody, please raise your hand. I'm not criticizing anybody. I just want to make sure we call on everybody who wants to. Okay.
The difference is the one-time payment is a payment made to Calpers and gone, whereas when you invest in Calpers for a particular leverage, that's loan that was given that you can get back. But I understand your point. The margins have to add up and make sense, but that's the difference.
John, you want to jump back to where I was and have me finish up the last few slides?
Yes, please. That'd be great.
I think I was on 16, maybe. Yeah. So as I said, these are the rates long term. We're always targeting to pay off all of the unfunded liability over several decades, and so that gets adjusted each year. But basically, several of you mentioned the unfunded liabilities. Obviously, those were built up over a number of years, and these rates are projected to pay them off over the next couple of decades. So if we go to the next slide, sort of turning our attention a little bit to the membership and how members are affected by the discount rate. Obviously, the top left here, as we talked about, the long-term sustainability of the plan is the fundamental objective of our board and our system. Active members only, so these are sort of active classic members, so those hired before 2013, very minor changes in some factors, but are generally affected by the discount rate. PEPR members, so these are, again, individual employees hired beginning in 2013. These are Glendale specific rates that your employees are right now, knowing what we know, and obviously things change a lot, but what we know today would expect less than a 1% increase in their contributions to the pension plan. So in essence, a reduction of those amounts of their take-home pay. And then retired members really don't have any changes based on cost of living allowances or their pension benefits under, I think you've heard the California rule and the state's court interpretations. Once someone has begun their time in a pension system in California, they're really locked into that benefit structure. And so that those folks who have worked their whole career and already retired are certainly, that's certainly the case there. So why don't we go ahead and move on to the next slide.
Michael, quick question.
Yeah.
When you say that the PEPR, this is how it affects the PEPR members, presumably that's because the normal cost increased by essentially twice that number, whatever that is. And I'm wondering, is the normal cost for classic members also going up? I realize it's not directly translated the same way it is for PEPR. But.
Yes, and that thank you, John. That was a great lead into the next slide. So let's go ahead and go there. So yes, when we lower the discount rate, the normal cost is going to go up, and that's, as I mentioned, sort of the long-term expectation of less returns on our assets. But really, under the law, it only pertains to PEPR members because, as you referenced, basically the law now requires employees to share 50-50 with its government employer, the normal cost. And so there's a somewhat complicated kind of banking of how much things have changed. But with this discount rate change, basically everyone's going over a 1% change. So you sort of keep track of what's happened since the last adjustment. And so so that you're not changing the rates every single year, once you get over 1%, you split that 1% between the employer and the employee. And that's what this slide's really just trying to capture, is that most folks that are PEPR are going to be across the state are going to be paying more, and it's always going to be 50-50, with their employer based on the latest data when the rates are finalized. So why don't we go ahead and get to the last couple slides here on implementation. And so, as I mentioned, over the next number of months, we're working on implementation plans for these new investment strategies. And then the school and the state face the rate effects earlier, and then a year later. So basically, 18 months from now, the city of Glendale will start seeing the rate changes based on these new decisions. And that's really a longstanding policy. Local employers have liked it because it gives them more time to plan. The state has as a bigger employer, has more capacity to adjust to the changes more quickly. But that's been something that employers have, at the local level, have really liked, kind of this lead time in knowing that what their rates are going to be a year and a half in advance. And then if we hit the last slide, again, just kind of for public agencies like the city of Glendale, this month there's going to be a circular letter kind of getting into the more nuanced impact of the changes that I've talked about a year from now, or a little less, next August, you sort of get these valuations that I mentioned are up on our website, giving you the formal rates for 23, 24, and then all those changes go into effect July 1 of 23. It's also worth, as I wrap up here on the slides, plugging, there's a tool we've created over the last couple of years called Pension Outlook that's on our website, that basically, if you create an account, and anyone can create an account, you can sort of go in and make a number of assumption changes and sort of see how that's going to affect a particular city. So, the city of Glendale can go in, or you can go in yourself and sort of play with it and sort of see how changing the assumptions would change your costs long term. But it's really something that our employers encouraged us to develop, so that they would have a better tool to know, okay, if you change something, what does that mean for my individual budget? What does it mean for my particular costs? And that's something that we'll be updating shortly to reflect all of these new assumptions. Until then, you can kind of get to the numbers, but you have to know what the right numbers are to plug in. But once we update that, I certainly encourage anyone watching or this group to go ahead and go on there and play with the numbers and see what they mean in terms of changing assumptions. So, and I think that was my last slide. Why don't I just turn it back to the group, and I'm happy to continue to have some back and forth.
Let me ask a quick question before everybody else. So I guess one area where I feel like, as a negotiator, that I'm handicapped, because I do a lot of labor negotiation, is it seems to me that Calpers' assumptions about increase in wage are kind of shrouded a little bit in mystery, and the impact of jumping the guardrails of those numbers is also a little bit shrouded in mystery. And I'm wondering if there's anything Calpers can do or has done that would make that a little clearer. I mean, as a completely practical matter, I'll put some meat on the bones here, which is, we've been in most of our negotiations over a shockingly long period of time running at roughly 3% a year. I mean, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more, but really at kind of 3%. And that is, as my understanding, is pretty much, it may be a little high, but it's basically what Calpers has been assuming for the purposes of, and it gets complicated, I know, because you have steps, and it's not just not just the 2.75, it's the steps and other things, et cetera. But I guess the question, as negotiators, we're now coming into a somewhat seemingly more inflationary environment. I don't know that to be true, but it seems like it's true. So you may start seeing, agreements that look more like 4s, let's say, or even 5s, who knows? And one thing that employers can't really do, Michelle mentioned that Glendale figures out the benefit costs. But what we don't typically do is figure out the actuarial cost of a package. Obviously, part of that is it's just really hard to do. It's complicated. I'm wondering if there's anything, any tool or anything that Calpers can do to allow that to be clearer, that impact to be clearer.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, talking with the city's actuary is certainly a good starting point. That John, what you mentioned was just updated in our new actuarial assumptions, so it's closer to 2.5% now in terms of expected wage growth over time. And obviously, if a jurisdiction is giving out pay raises that long term are significantly above that assumption of 2.5%, you're going to end up with greater liabilities that show up. Both at the end of an experience study every 4 years, but also kind of as extra costs. And, the actuarial valuations that I've mentioned several times, I think, give you a good sense of, if you go year by year, you can get a dollar amount effect of, the various bases that have changed over time and what assumptions kind of have been missed or hit, leading to either an increased or a decreased cost. So those really are great resources. The actuarial valuation, there's under the employer tab on our website, you can kind of search by jurisdiction. So you can plug Glendale in there and take a look at them. They're not the most exciting read, but they do have an amazing amount of data and information. And as I mentioned, our actuaries will be happy to walk through those details with the city's management at any point.
Zara?
Thank you, Mr. Holtzman, Zari, Marion. Just to follow up on that, does Ms. Flynn, does the city of Glendale run its own risk assessment based upon, is there a specific risk assessment that the city of Glendale runs? For example, depending upon the assumptions put into place and the discount rate, the chances of the city of Glendale's unfunded liabilities, increasing over 50%, for example. Is that something that's looked at by the city of Glendale specifically?
Michelle? Oh, you're...
There we go. Not specifically. We do utilize Bartel and Associates for our actuaries. So we do get a lot of the information from them and the Calpers reports, but we don't do anything specific to what you just mentioned as far as that goes. It is pretty hypothetical. If we do look at things like that, we can. We would probably need Bartel to help us run some of that, because there is so much actuarial assumptions that we cannot do in-house, that we're not actuaries. We would miss the mark on that type of thing. So
yeah, and I mean, obviously, looking at risks that impact every municipality in the state of California versus risks specific to our municipality, the city of Glendale, considering that maybe we are more financially healthy, let's say, than the average city, and the assumptions that go into the fact that we have our own PD and our own fire department, would that be something that might be beneficial to look at in order to make the best decisions moving forward?
I think it would depend on what the goal of a study like that would be, but certainly it could be considered for sure. I mean, if there's some clear goals on what we want on the outcomes of that, and we can target it and move forward. But yeah, I think it could be beneficial, just depending on what we're trying to get to.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Cohen, by the way. If I didn't say thank you for your presentation.
Mr. Zakarian.
Hi, everyone. I hope all is well. First off, I'd like to thank Mr. Cohen for being here with us. So thank you for your time and your efforts for being here with us. Secondly, I'd like to congratulate Michelle Flynn and Matt Dole on their retirement. I wanted to get that out there. Their dedication to this committee itself does not even come close to what they've done for the city of Glendale. So thank you to both of you putting out there on public television to make sure that everybody understands that we appreciate them very much. A couple of questions for you, Mr. Cohen. I'm keeping it very basic and simple to create a better foundation for myself. A couple of questions is, how have past projections from Calpers been compared to their actuals? Based on my understanding, it seems like they've been pretty good, but have they been pretty accurate as far as your projections versus your actuals?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we're not going to nail it every single year, but long term, I think you would say that they've been pretty accurate. That being said, we obviously update them as we go. So it's not as if any of our assumptions were made in 1980 and then we walk away and say, okay, what are they in 2020? If that was the case, we would be way off because so many different things have changed. But I would think you could say our assumptions have been fairly accurate over time.
Okay, next question is, as far as the expected discount rate going into the future, we had 7, it's 6.8 now. Are we expecting that to continue to drop, making our contributions more for the city of Glendale, or are we expecting that to stay right around 6.8?
Yeah, I would say the long-term trend has been downward. You know, that being said, the pandemic certainly accelerated the downward trend faster than most of us were expecting on the sort of investment expectations. But under our risk mitigation policy that I talked about, there is still room for further declines incrementally over time. But that's something our board will kind of check in with us periodically, and we'll be having those discussions next year.
Okay, and as far as the outlook for the city of Glendale, I know you put up that graph on one of the slides of the employer contribution continuing to be less all the way up to 2047. So pretty much what I understand is for the city of Glendale to continue where we're at right now and hold where we're at, the employer contribution will continue to drop, as you explained, because of the Pepper employees now coming more into play. And I believe that has a big part in the safety contribution of this whole thing and the cost of that. But as Pepper employees become the majority of the workforce, it'll help the city get that contribution to be less. Correct?
Yes, that's right. It long term, you know, the costs are expected to decline until we get closer to that level where cities are only paying sort of for the annual cost again, which is where you really want it. And that's due to, I didn't check Glendale specifics, but system wide, roughly half of our employees are now Pepper members. And so they're contributing more. They have lower benefits. They're expected to work longer. All of those things are driving system costs downward.
Absolutely, and I totally understand it. As the vice president of our local, we have lots of Pepper employees that now definitely are kind of starting to talk a little bit more about what their contribution is going to be like and the long-term effects of them. But they're starting to understand that a little bit more. I'd like to back up with what Zari and Emrian said, and to the healthy and the conscious effort of Michelle Flynn and the rest of the city staff. I do believe that we are a healthy city compared to the other cities around us. I think the fire chief put up an example based only on fire, but we are more efficient and do cost less than some of the other cities around us, and having some of the best accounting and finance department that I know of with our reserve in the city of Glendale have continued to stay at top of the rates, and we continue to be a Class 1 city. So thank you guys for your time. I appreciate it.
Mr. Milano?
Here?
You're muted.
Okay, thank you very much. In researching and in preparing for these discussions, I've been looking at how the city made decisions with regard to the MOUs. And I was wondering whether these type of activities are somehow evaluated at all, if asked by Calpers. So I'm looking at the last 20 years, and two things were highlighted to me as I researched the information. The first thing is that the city scrapped a 4-year agreement with the fire department. They had 3 more years remaining on their MOU, and they scrapped it and basically started fresh with a whole new benefit, the 3% at 50 in 2001. So we had an MOU, and I figured that the Calpers on liability as calculated would have been based on the previous MOUs that was submitted, and the city scrapped it. And they also scrapped the police department's MOU in 2001, shortening it and basically coming up with a whole new one. So I would imagine those would have been surprises as such to the calculation system as in trying to determine the overall liability. And in researching as well the workforce demographics of the city, which is, I find it very relevant. The city during a 10-year period, around from 1998 forward, had a 50% increase in management and a 3% increase in the rank and file, according to the workforce demographic reports. So here we have activities that a city council is doing in scrapping an MOU, number one, and then increasing management. How does Calpers, if at all, provide the type of guidance to city council when they begin making these type of very significant changes, personnel changes, right? Let alone increases in pay and so forth. because the numbers show that given what we were in 2001, we had a surplus of about 150. Now we have an unfunded pension liability of 640. And given the amount of money that we have provided, basically we have close to $1 billion in shortfall, right? When you count going from a surplus to a significant deficit. So where does Calpers provide guidance to cities with regard to how their policies are impacting their future obligations and finding themselves so significantly in the hole? Do you have an answer for that in terms of, does Calpers provide that type of advice?
Look, I think I would start by saying 20 plus years ago, CalPERS and basically every jurisdiction in California made some less than astute financial decisions. I certainly can speak to that from my experience working on the state budget, but I assume that spreads throughout each jurisdiction. So I don't know how valuable it is to replay decisions that have been made and led to countless other decisions year after year after that, reacting to the decisions that were made. That being said, we're certainly, this CalPERS administration is committed to providing jurisdictions whatever information we have available to us, and we stand committed to do that. So ultimately, it comes down to a city council and the management team in seeking information. But we are committed to providing everything we possibly can to help jurisdictions make the best decisions for your community as you can.
Thank you very much.
One thing I'd just like to add to what Michael said, I'm not weighing in one way or another, but PEPRA, I know this because I've been doing some research on it, believe it or not, a jurisdiction that wants to raise a particular benefit. PEPRA has put a number of restraints in place that would make it hard to replicate the mistakes of 20 years ago, including the fact that you can't have retroactive increases, which is a pretty significant change. And of course, as Michael said, the actual plans themselves are written into PEPRA, so there's that too. But so I'm not suggesting all is good, but I am saying there are a lot more protections in the law now than there were 20 years ago.
Mr. Holtzman, if I could make a comment.
Yes, please.
I really am not sure of the accuracy of what Mr. Milano just said. And again, I was not at the bargaining table 20 years ago when these items were initially negotiated on the 3850 for our police and fire. But as I understand it, there were two MOUs that are in question here, and one of them did very clearly, I believe it was the police officer one, did indicate that the enhanced retirement would be part of it, of that agreement, and it was addressed in that. And I believe it was a 4-year MOU from 2000 to 2004. And then the firefighters one, GFFA, was I believe it was 1999, which was a 3-year MOU, 1999 to 2002. And it was right about that time that there was just beginning discussions of these enhanced retirement plans. And that one, I think, made a vague reference to it. And I believe it required a reopener should the enhanced retirements come in effect. And so there were references to those 350 benefits. Again, I'm not clear what Mr. Milano meant when he said that MOUs were scrapped. These were negotiated, as I understand, in good faith. We can always play Monday morning quarterback about what occurred 20 years ago, but these were benefits that were made available, and essentially all of the unions, based on representations made by CalPERS, its funding capabilities, all of the unions jumped on these new benefits, and it became fairly common. And again, we look back at it now, particularly the retroactive part of it, and realize that those were not good decisions. But nevertheless, those benefits were negotiated in good faith, and and anyone who's ever negotiated knows in order to maintain good, qualified, competent staff, you have to be competitive. And if your neighbors are offering those benefits, you have to seriously consider it as well. So, thank you.
Let me see before I call on Mr. Milano if there are other hands, because I just want to make sure we're getting folks. Okay, Mr. Milano, I don't see any other hands.
All right, thank you. Yeah, Mr. Doyle is correct. I read the MOU, and actually I submitted it as part of the documentation for all of the committee members to look at. Yeah, there was a line in it that says, in the event that this particular state law that occurred in whatever 1999 would be applied by the city of Glendale, that they would be renegotiating. I'm quite aware of that. And there's this particular line. What is of concern? There are two things that are of concern to me. Is that the number of employees in the Glendale for the Glendale Fire and Police as a percentage of the classic employees is significantly larger than it is for the general employees, right? I think they're like around 30%, and everybody else is getting, I don't know, closer to maybe 50. So it means that we are carrying significantly a burden. In other words, it's not that firefighters by and large and policemen by and large are now in PEPRA. On the contrary, they're still under the classic arrangement. And that actually is going to bear significantly as we go forward in the next few years with regard to how much additional debt will be accumulated to the unfunded liability. So I wanted to, all these points that I'm bringing forward is that we can empower ourselves with how the decisions were made such that future city councils can look at the process of how the MOUs were arrived at, and for them to be either aware or able to make a better determination. But I want to add one more item. I also put two video links to the actual vote that occurred in 2001. And I made an inference based upon watching those videos, and that there was only less than 60 seconds in terms of from the time that it was introduced to passage or to the vote on both instances, when it was introduced and when it was voted on to be confirmed. I guess I forgot the actual term used, but almost no deliberation, no input from anybody. And I think it is pertinent for committee members to look at that video and assess for themselves that the process by which a city council devises and discusses an MOU, the way new city council members become apprised of the process, is incredibly important. And those should be part of the solutions that we bring up to the city council. In addition, your suggestion that we get the full picture of the total liability of the pension going forward 30 years, which is actually provided in the CAFR, that those should be clearly aware to the city council members before they vote on the MOU. And our lack of participation from the public, because the MOUs are secret, and in some states it is open, those discussions are open to the general public, that we need to really recommend to the city council policies based upon how the procedures got us to where we are today. And that was my whole point in bringing those videos that I recommend for everybody to watch. Thank you.
Thank you. So listen, I don't want to keep Michael any longer than we need him for issues as regards Calpers, and a lot of these issues are becoming kind of local issues that go to what we're doing. So let me ask if there are any more questions for Michael and Calpers. Yeah, Grant.
Just one follow-up question. With PEPRA, you've mentioned other controls that were put in place. What is the procedure for a municipality or other members of Calpers to go ahead and request additional controls or point out areas that they'd like to change to try and prevent some of the mistakes of the past, as you've said?
Yeah, I mean, I think the retroactive benefit increase is worth stating one more time, just so that's clear. So back in the 2001 era, when benefit formulas were changed, if someone was, the day before they were going to retire, if a jurisdiction adopted the benefit change, that applied to all of their years of service, so that the next day when they retired, they had a substantially different benefit than what they'd been planning for their entire career. And most importantly, no one had put a dime into the system expecting that that change. So that is now illegal under state law. And in most cases, I can't think of an example where a jurisdiction could have any meaningful effect on pension benefits broadly. You would have to go to the legislature, get a bill introduced, passed out of one house, passed to the next house, sent to the governor, and signed by the governor to make a change that would increase pension benefits. So that all of those things now would require a state law change, whereas in the past, there was a lot of flexibility, sort of a menu of choices of benefits that cities could choose from.
Well, more specifically, I was asking not so much of increasing benefits, but of making a change to how benefits may be calculated, other aspects of how the city might contribute to the unfunded liability, or if the city can go ahead and essentially try and make configurations that may benefit the city, specifically with their CalPERS plan, or does everything have to go through the legislature, and is it all controlled from the legislature down?
Yeah, I mean, the benefit structure is under the domain of the legislature and the governor. The payments is very much under the control of the individual member jurisdiction. So we have a number of tools available to cities if they want to pay down their unfunded liability faster. The city, I believe, made a discretionary payment to the pension fund last year. That's certainly a one-time simple thing to do, basically just sending the mortgage company an extra check, and we credit that to the city's account. We also, several years ago, set up a pre-funding trust program where the city can create a trust where they deposit funds, they're invested, so you're going to earn more than if they were just cash on hand at the city level. And then the city can decide in what year and what amount to basically make payments to CalPERS. So if you were ever in a recession and the city was facing budget cuts, but you had a balance in this trust fund, you would be able to transfer those assets over to CalPERS in lieu of making your normal payment in order to help you kind of balance your budget. Those are two examples that are completely under the city's control. There's also the ability to work with the actuaries to kind of reconfigure your debt structure so that you pay off the debt faster, in essence, refinancing a mortgage to a shorter term. That piece is irrevocable once you do it, so it has less flexibility for the city. But I would say from a city perspective, to the extent the city is committed to paying off its pension liabilities faster, there's a significant amount of flexibility in the law to work directly with CalPERS to accomplish that, and that it's not something in general. I haven't heard any jurisdiction come to us saying, hey, how come we can't do this or that in terms of making extra payments. That I think the law is pretty flexible in terms of your various payment options.
Thank you. I just wanted to go ahead and clarify that if this committee comes up with ideas or areas to explore, that there is an avenue to proceed down that path.
Absolutely. We can, I'm certainly at your disposal, and my team as well, that we will figure out if what you're looking at is something forbidden by state law and would need a change. Otherwise, we do have a fair amount of flexibility built in terms of additional payments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? I do have another business item for us after Michael leaves. So, but if there are other questions, let's do that. Seeing none, I'm going to let Michael go. Thank you so much, really, for coming and being so patient with us and all of that. We really, really appreciate your help, and I appreciate that you're up there at Calpers, particularly as somebody who had experience in having to balance a budget.
Yes, thank you for doing everything you're doing, and thanks for having me. Everyone have a good night.
Take care. Okay, so the remaining item I wanted to discuss is, and I know that we had talked about doing this in executive committee, but I wanted to do this actually with the full committee. I am sensitive to the desire for us to have dissenting or critiques, let's say, of some of the things that have been presented so far. And I am kind of seeking some advice from everybody here about who we'd like to invite. And I'd like to do it starting next time, if possible. I do have some other things we want to cover, including this 115 plan that Michael was referring to. That's the pre-funding mechanism that he was talking about. We do this, by the way, through PARS, not through CalPERS, but it's exactly the same thing. We put aside money that earns, significant interest rate. And you have, Michelle, you have like $50 million in that fund or something like that. Is that right?
I haven't looked at the balance for about a week or so, but it was hovering pretty close to 50 million. Yes.
So which is a really significant amount of money, although nothing compared to the total amount of money, the unfunded liability, but it's a lot of money. So I do want to.
It may be closer to 40. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I don't think it's 50. I think it's closer to 40. My apologies.
So we do want to talk about pre-funding. We do want to talk about pension obligation bonds. But before we move to that point, I think it would be helpful to get some critiques. And I have been struggling. I did talk to Chuck Reed. Chuck does not want to come, but because he says he's retired from pension issues. However, he has suggested Pete Constant. I do know Pete from San Jose, and Pete was the head of the nonprofit that Chuck put together on pension issues. So I was planning on inviting Pete to talk. But I know, Mr. Milano, Mr. Kadikian, a few folks have expressed an interest in the critique, and I think it makes a lot of sense. I'm just trying to get some guidance from you guys about who you'd like to see. Mr. Milano.
I've made several recommendations that I sent to you. And with regard to CalPERS, there was a board member of CalPERS who was voted out recently, and she was an adamant critic of the way CalPERS functions. And I think that to get a balance on Mr. Cohen's presentation today, I think, I don't remember her name. I wrote it down, but I don't have it in front of me.
It's like, I'll figure it out.
Yeah. But she was a strong critic of the way CalPERS performs, the way they set up their compensation, the way they make their investments, and so forth, because it highlights the level of risk to that investment return numbers that have been given to us. So that was one of my concerns. The other speaker that I would love to see come to speak to us is someone who can put these obligations in context of what it means to city governance. Because at the end of the day, I could ask everyone to basically say what is the purpose of a city government or a municipality, but in shorthand is to serve the public. And sure, everything that we do during this process of defining how much money should be set aside and how much obligation are we willing to tolerate and how much additional debt we're going to incur in order to meet that obligation, without looking at the context of how these funds impact city services and the things that we have to do without as a result, to me, gives the sense of urgency as to how this problem needs to be faced. The reason why we're meeting is because this unfunded liability and the future payments in the next 10 years are going to significantly impact the way the city performs or the additional taxation that we need to impose on everyone. And I'd like to be able to bring a critic who can place this obligation in the context of how a city functions.
Zara?
Mr. Holtzman, I noticed that Ms. Wilson has had her hand up for a while now.
I totally apologize. It's very hard to see the hand things here. I totally apologize.
Hi, thank you so much. Mr. Holtzman, thank you for bringing this up, because I was planning to ask a question toward the end of the meeting, because we did have materials submitted by committee members that never seemed to get on the agenda. And, you know, I think that when people are collecting this material, I think it's their intention probably that they want the committee to talk about it, not just to have it attached as an information only report. I think maybe Mr. Milano was talking about Margaret Brown. Does that, maybe he can wave or say, indicate if he thinks that's correct? Yes, I've spoken with Ms. Brown when I voted in the board election last. I spoke with 3 out of the 4 candidates who were running. Yeah, I think we need to hear something other than just the party line, if you will. So thanks.
Yeah, I mean, for whatever it's worth, I don't think anybody disagrees that we need to challenge the orthodoxy. So the challenge in my mind is, you know, is figuring out the who. Now we do have, I mean, materials that could be debated separate from individuals coming in, because we do have, as you say, the materials that have been you know, going all the way back to, you know, Little Hoover, et cetera. I mean, there are materials, and we all, I think anybody like me who works in pension reform, Little Hoover is kind of the Magna Carta of pension reform. You know, I would like to bring, though, you know, some outspoken leaders who bring information, you know, along with them, and so that's why I'm asking. We don't have to do it that way. We can just have a discussion, which I can lead, or, you know, I can guide, I guess is maybe the right word, using that information. I would like to see, and I've got a reason why I'm reaching out to you guys, and I can do this myself too. I particularly would like to see. And maybe this ex-board member from Calpers will help. Somebody who has focused on Calpers governance and on you know, Calpers, you know, other changes in Calpers that we'd like to see. I think that, you know.
I just wanted to clarify. I was not saying not to have, say, Margaret Brown or somebody else like that come out and speak to us. But also, I think we do need to talk about the materials that have been submitted. I'm saying we need to do both. Thanks.
Mr. Milano. Oh, I'm sorry. Wait. Mr. Amirian was ahead of you this time. I apologize.
Thank you. No worries. I knew you'd get around to me eventually anyway. I appreciate it. Yeah, I think the group, by the way, that Miss Brown belongs to is called Your Calpers Watchdog or something to that effect. So it has a former board member in Margaret Brown, a former board member in JJ Jelinchich, and then, you know, a retired police fraud investigator. Another name I might throw out was Ron Lagnado, Lagnado. He left Calpers last year. He was actually part of their investment team. And he's been fairly vocal recently in terms of talking about how the current Calpers investment strategy might be exposing municipalities to some significant downside in terms of the manner in which they're investing. And I think it's something that we do need to consider in terms of assessing risk, just to have, an opposing viewpoint. In terms of, I also wanted to talk about materials submitted. I do appreciate board members who take the time to look through and submit materials. I would request, just from my point of view, that the materials that are submitted maybe be a little bit more curated in terms of volume of what I'm required to go through in terms as a board member to find what the what the actual meat of the matter is. So for example, we received 133 pages and 3 gigabytes worth of video. And there were some mentions of where to go look, but that's a tremendous amount of information for me to sift through and for other board members to sift through. And I imagine it's a tremendous amount of information, if staff is putting that together as well or looking that up. So I agree. I'd love to talk about those submissions in a meaningful manner, but it's impossible to do so if I'm unable to actually, read through 130 pages of material or watch 3 gigabytes of, download and watch 3 gigabytes of video.
Do you think it would make sense for us where there are submitted materials? Because up till now, honestly, because we sort of scheduled out these sessions, so there hasn't been that much opportunity to settle in with the materials that we have. But now we're getting to the point where we can. Do you think it would make sense to have those materials that have been submitted be presented by some board members? I mean, there's nothing wrong with having board members present some of these materials.
Yeah, and I, just to follow up on that, I think it would make sense. I would suggest that we, have some sort of reasonable boundaries and guidelines in terms of what those presentations look like. Otherwise, we're risking, having really lengthy presentations.
No, I think we would need a time limit. I agree with that completely. I suspect everybody on the board probably agrees with that. Mr. Milano, you've been.
Well, I've today, Mr. Amirian presented some really cogent and valuable questions. I really appreciate that. And I also understand that looking at a video from 20 years ago and, a 2-hour presentation or 2.5 hours is not necessarily the most judicious way of looking at a video. And so I could possibly take the video and clip the sections that are pertinent and make those available. And the same thing with some of the other documents to basically highlight what is the main point that I would like for the committee members to look at. So what is striking about the council sessions, in my interpretation of those council sessions, could probably be viewed in that 2 or 3 minute period of time when the ordinance was introduced and how it was voted, and then how and how it was adopted in the manner in which it was adopted. So I'm looking at procedure and the various different alternatives. Now, in management consulting and a process that I advocate, is a process where we really try to be, when presenting all these various different types of options for discussion, that they be mutually exclusive and collaboratively exhaustive, so that all of the issues that are pertinent to giving the city council recommendations means that we went through all the possible scenarios that are relevant to how the pension obligation increases. So if they increase pay, that's relevant. If they increase the number of managers, that's relevant. If the ratio of managers to rank and file is changing so that you get more managers being hired than, or the ratios are being changed, that's going to change the payroll. That's relevant to the pensions. If we are providing an earlier retirement date, that's also relevant. In other words, the list of things that impact payroll and the other post-employment benefits are part of the obligation that the city of Glendale, or at least the taxpayers, would have to pay. The other areas that I think are relevant to say is, if we have this shortfall of $1 billion, how does it reflect on city services and city infrastructure and the things that we don't get to do? Because those are the things that are relevant to the general population, to the general voter, to say, if we go on board accepting yet another debt on top of what we have, or if Calpers decides to do investment on margin, as many people did back in the 1990s, we could be in for a very significant risk that we need to understand. And so in our process, I think that part of what we're doing is understanding all of the ramifications of a pension system such that we can create a template for a future city council, including this one, to say, before you go into an MOU and accept these are the relevant topics that you must consider, because the repercussions are this, right? It means roads don't get built, infrastructure and water lines don't get built, and so forth. And so that's why I want, as one of the recommendations for this committee to consider, is for the finance to come back to us, especially now that they're presenting the CAFR next week, to say, what is the total obligation of the cities, of the city, including those deferred infrastructure needs? Because these debts are part of that whole pie of obligations that we have. And that's a relevant discussion. And it's part of the elements that we should present to a city council. At the end of the day, the city is serving the public through its services or its infrastructure. And if we are now servicing debt instead of doing those basic things, if we now need to hire fewer policemen because most of them are now retired, those are relevant pieces of discussion that we must include in a report to city council.
So let me say this, because we're running short on time, and I want to make sure we hear from everybody. I guess a question in my mind is, I think in the ideal world, I'd like our session or other session in December to be from some of the I'll call them the critics. It's not quite fair, but the contrarian views or whatever and then maybe what we do is our first session in January, and maybe even our second. I'm thinking we might even have to add a session in January, but that we do some presentations by board members. I could flip it and do it the other way if there's a preference to have presentations by some board members in December and have the advocates, the critics, in January. I'm okay either way. Is there a preference? No. So, assuming that means there isn't a preference, let me go ahead with my plan. Wait, Ms. Wilson, you're muted.
I know I'm muted. I was just saying, I see there's several hands raised.
I'm sorry, my bad. If that's
I think Grant Michaels has his hand raised, and Michelle.
Grant, do you have your hand raised? Oh, you do have your hand raised. I'm so sorry.
I just intended to talk at the next executive committee meeting of how the submissions were handled. I do believe that the large submissions, the documents that were submitted both by Mr. Milano, Mr. Kadikian, that I would like to see some type of a presentation by those board members to explain the documents, share their perspective, rather than just having the rest of the committee members read through hundreds of pages of supporting documentation. I wanted to discuss how we would best do that. And the presentation would be something to discuss. So know that I plan to talk about that at the next executive committee meeting.
I appreciate that. I do think that it feels like there's a desire to do that sooner rather than later, to have these conversations and to have some presentation on these materials. So rather than holding that off, let's tentatively plan to do that at the next meeting. I'll at the executive committee we can talk about. Do we have, when is the next XCOM? Let's okay. So what would be good is if we could have an XCOM next week, so that we could talk about either the beginning of next week or the end of this week, so that we could talk about, you know, how those presentations are going to be structured.
Mr. Holtzman, there's a few hands that have been raised. It was Susan Wilson, followed by Michelle Flynn, Roland Gadikin, and then Zaria Miriam.
Go for it.
Ms. Wilson.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to say, I was gonna text somebody. I'm willing to help get some of the materials organized. I'm very, very good at this, and I have a lot of knowledge about, like, I think there was like a huge multi-100-page submission that was part of our information packet this period, for this meeting, and there's ways to get that organized with an executive summary that would show the basics of each contract and each amendment, let's say, for example, maybe in a timeline, so that it was chronological, and I'm more than happy to try and help in that way. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. That sounds great. John? Who was the next hand? I think you're muted.
No, she's not muted.
Ms. Flynn?
Oh, my turn. Sorry. Okay. I just wanted to address Mr. Milano's comments with regards to trying to put together, you know, like what the impacts to the city services, infrastructure, et cetera, based on the pension obligations and pension payments. That is not anything that we would be prepared to present to council tomorrow night when we take our annual report. It is not even something I don't think is feasibly possible to put together because of the numerous assumptions that we would have to make. What I can tell you, though, is that the pension payments have been paid in full every single year since I've been at the city, and I would assume prior to that as well, which is in excess. I've been here almost 22 years. That is budgeted, it's paid. We have made extra payments. We have been able to set up the Section 115 trust to help mitigate the risk of our increases in the coming years. The pension liability is not budgeted. It is a liability. It's similar to your mortgage payment, where in your annual budget or your monthly budget of your home or your house expenses, you would budget your payment to the bank. You wouldn't budget your balance that you owe to the bank. So that liability is recorded on the books, but is not budgeted because we don't make that payment in a given year. And it is basically an actuarial assumption of what that liability is, as we have discussed. So we don't have capacity, nor do we have any way of making any of those assumptions to try to put together what the impact of city services or roads or any of that would have been on our residents or in our city. I can tell you that in my experience, the time I've been in finance and working on budget, we have not cut city services. Road money is handled out of different funds specific for those purposes. And all those discussions happen every spring with the city council during budget time. So I don't want to give any false hope that we're going to be able to do anything like that to this committee, because that is definitely not something that we would be able to do.
Mr. Kadikian.
Thank you. I just want to clarify the information that I requested, not submitted. I requested information about the Calpers agreement, and I got the same information about a couple of days or 3-4 days prior, pursuant to California Public Records request. So this is information I requested. I didn't submit it to the whole committee, but it's fine that the whole committee got, and I can tell you I am as shocked at the amount and this fragmented and incoherent way that all that information is presented. It's amendment after amendment after amendment. And for my California public records, at the end of it was the whole statute about CalPERS and everything, all the laws relating to CalPERS. So if somebody wants me to give some sort of a presentation about information I requested about that, that's beyond my scope and capability. And that is precisely why I asked for an expert to look at this and have an expert to come in and explain it to us. So I just want to be clear to the committee members. I'm not dumping all this information on you to read it and disseminate it. That's information I requested, and I had no idea it's this much and this fragmented. So that's why I wanted an expert to explain this to us, whether there's any way we can challenge anything with regards to CalPERS and our agreement. That's my comment on that issue.
All right, and let me just say, with respect to us putting it out, it's my philosophy that that anything that we provide, even though you did it under Public Records Act, anything we provide to a committee member, we provide to all committee members. I realize that may have resulted inadvertently in a ridiculously large number of documents, but that's just my philosophy, because I think the opposite philosophy gets you in trouble. But anyway, Mr. Amirian.
Thank you, Mr. Holtzman. I would agree, and I think this is something we'll probably delve into in the executive committee, but I think it's important to speak to it about it here as well. I would agree that the next full committee meeting is the time to do those member presentations, mostly for logistical reasons in terms of the holidays and trying to get, a speaker to commit, during that time, a few days before Christmas, I think is going to be challenging. I also would like to maybe spend some time at that meeting discussing what the deliverables might look like for our board, especially considering the earlier we can have some clarity and consensus on that issue, the more lead time it's going to give to staff members in order to help facilitate us being able to do that with any information we might need or any help we might need from them. So I think, for the next meeting, that might be something that we spend some significant time discussing as well.
I think that's an excellent idea. I am wondering whether, because I think the most critical thing before we get off is to schedule an executive committee meeting. I'm wondering, and this is because of the televising part, this is where life gets complicated. John, I'm wondering, is it possible to do anything next Monday, or are we just out completely?
Off the top of my head, I don't know, because there might be I think there is a commission meeting. If you give me 5 minutes, I can find out.
Okay, would Monday, let me just ask the executive committee members, would Monday work for you if it's okay, before we send John to find out? See. Milano, good, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Monday.
All right.
What time was asked by Mr. Bain, I believe?
I think you're going to see what's available. I think John was going to see what's available. I can make almost anything work on my calendar after about 10:30.
Would the committee be okay with a meeting during the day?
Yes.
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 Okay. I don't want to get anyone's hopes. Hold on 1 second.
Committee or just executive committee?
This is the executive committee, Ms. Wilson.
Mr. Holtzman, we do have a caller on the line. If
Okay, while John's working on this, why don't we take that caller?
How many minutes would you like to provide to the caller?
Always.
3 minutes. Thank you. Mr. Mohil, you're live. You have 3 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. Good evening, council member. Excuse me. Sorry. Committee members. My name is Mike Mohill. I find tonight's meeting very interesting. The person who's represented Calpers did his job. Everything is good. He's saying, yeah, we made some mistakes in the past, but we're going to do better in the future. I've been hearing that for about 15 years as we get deeper and deeper in debt in this city. Then we talk about having a pension bond, a debt for the next generation. But this pension bond has no way out to get rid of Calpers. It keeps the state in this horrible system called Calpers. Who benefits but city employees and their families? But the residents of Glendale, including the children who have to pay this burdensome debt, are stuck with this crazy thing called Calpers. Back in 1999, they changed the pension system that, for example, police and firemen basically could retire from, the program went from 75% of last year's salary for a pension to 90%. Outrageous. And conservatives back in those days said, this will never fly, will never work. And they were right. Michelle Flynn said, she was saying here, we pay all our debts. Yes, she's right. By raising taxes and fees. Why did we have Measure S approved and pushed by the city council? Because they need to raise an additional $30 million minimum every year. Will it be a Measure D next time, or an S, or double S? The amount of money will never stop. The only way out is to have a final pension bond that will get us out of Calpers, not stay in Calpers. You can say, well, the other cities are in Calpers. Good for them. We can be a leader and put all city employees, including police and firemen, I love them all, but a 401k plan and Social Security. What makes government employees special and the people who have to pay the bills look like idiots? The idiots are the city council members who accept campaign contributions from the unions and then do their bidding. I hope this committee, which includes Calpers employees, which is the fox in the henhouse, do something different. Don't kick the can down the road. I've been hearing that every year. They're going to massage the numbers. Every time the city employees contribute more money to their contribution towards their pension, big deal. It's a great investment. Because when they live 25 and 35 years beyond retirement, that's the best investment they ever did by putting some money into the retirement fund.
Mr. Moyle, your time is up.
Thank you. And again, I'll say one last thing. The goal of this committee should be to get out of Calpers and have a final bond to get out of Kent. Make it the final pension bond. I thank you. I know I'm repeating myself, but thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a great night, Mr. Moyle.
Okay, back to John.
Sure, Mr. Holzman. We don't have any availability after 6, as I suspected, but we can do any time next Monday, the 13th, between 10 o'clock and about 6 o'clock in the afternoon. So it's pretty wide open.
What do you guys think about, say, 3 to 5? Excellent. I'm thinking of
good.
All thumbs up. So 3 to 5 it is.
That works for me as well. Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you, Alice.
Mr. Holzman.
Yes.
Mr. Holzman, I've oftentimes when I make my a suggestion for discussion, and I get a rebuttal from the staff, I oftentimes get the feeling that there are concepts that I need to clarify or to help my committee members understand. So when Ms. Flynn rebutted my suggestion, I do want the committee members to understand the difference between a budget and the CAFR. This coming week, the CAFR, the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, the audited reports, is going to be presented. And in there, the liabilities of the city can be actually be roughly estimated. But what it doesn't do, and no financial report does, it doesn't tell you what the contingent liability is when maintenance has not been done. In other words, if we have $200 or $300 million in arrears with regard to the potential changes and improvements to the Glendale Water and Power, that's relevant in terms of the overall obligation. And oftentimes, whenever I've been present and talking at the end of the sessions of the budget sessions, generally it's because a lot of these topics have not been presented. Putting the debt and the way we manage debt in the city and in many other municipalities in California is truly relevant. How we fund cities on debt is significantly important to what we're going to leave behind for our children in posterity. The whole idea of running cities to the extent that the debt increases significantly is of merit for us to discuss, because we need to be able to present that idea to the city council and to the public at large. So I just want to make sure that these differentials are clear, and why it is so important that we have a context-based discussion of how the pension system impacts the city in the long haul. Thank you.
Okay, so let me just say one thing, and I don't want to say anything prolongs the meeting, but you know, I think the challenge is you can absolutely show what you know what I mean, or at least theoretically, at least demonstrate what are the unmet needs of the city in terms of you know, in terms of infrastructure, et cetera. That's typically something that cities, you know, do a pretty good job of tracking what their unmet needs are in that respect. What you can't do, and I would resist the committee trying to do, is attribute any particular debt or unmet need to any particular thing that costs money. A lot of things cost money. Wages cost money, benefits cost money, other things cost money. You can't unscramble that egg, and I am resistant to trying to unscramble the egg. I don't mind the thought that at all that, and I do this, by the way, I do fact finding for cities in which I say, look, you Mr. Fact Finder, shouldn't agree to give these guys 5%, because not only do we have this huge pension debt, but we have these other obligations, unmet infrastructure obligations, et cetera. I make this argument all the time. So I don't disagree with the broader point that cities have many unmet obligations that are very important. And I don't know any city that doesn't have unmet obligations. If I find one, though, I'm going there and I'm going to live there. So my only point, and I just want to be a little careful about this, is what I think Ms. Flynn was reacting to was more the point of the unscrambling piece, which is I don't really think is possible to do. You can inferentially say you spent X on pension and that would have been spent on something else, but you don't know that. You can't know that.
Mr. Holtzman, I want to add a short comment to that. I spent most of my adult life as a consultant to mid-sized corporations, with the whole idea of that the processing of all the data eventually comes out as an analysis of how the company's performance or the entity's performance has been, so that the decision makers can make a cogent decision as to how to move forward based on what the data tells you. So I think that before we judge what this presentation may look like, let me get a crack at it and demonstrate through charts and graphs what it actually means. And I think that many members might find that there is a valid argument to be made that the decisions that the city has before it needs to be placed in the context of what has transpired in the past.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay. Do we have any further thoughts for the evening, or are we ready to break? Looks like we're ready to break. Anybody like to make a motion to adjourn?
I will move to adjourn.
Second.
We're adjourned at 8:49 p.m.
Have a
Thank
good
you.
night, everybody. Thank you.
Good night.
Great night. Have a great night.